Faith pushed the slightly open door wider, stepping cautiously into the house. The air was thick, suffocating, and eerily silent. The sitting room was in utter chaos. Broken glass on the floor, the coffee table flipped over, and a deep red stain smeared across the white couch. Her heart pounded. Something was wrong. "Peter? Susan?" she called, her voice shaking. No response. She hesitated before stepping further inside. Her high heels crunched against shards of glass as she moved past the overturned furniture. The television screen was cracked, as though someone had thrown something at it with force. Her stomach churned. She called again, louder this time. "Susan! Peter! Are you guys here?" Still no answer. The silence was unbearable. A cold chill ran down her spine as she made her way toward the kitchen. Maybe they were inside. Maybe they had an argument and stormed off. Maybe... She stepped through the doorway and her breath caught in her throat. There in the middle of the kitchen floor was Peter. His lifeless body sprawled out in a pool of blood. His pants were soaked in crimson, his manhood severed. His face was twisted in pain, his mouth slightly open as if in a final scream. A kitchen knife lay a few inches away, slick with blood. And next to him was Susan. Her body was slumped against the kitchen counter, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. A deep stab wound in her neck had painted her entire blouse red. Her eyes were open, empty, staring into nothingness. Faith's world spun. She staggered backward, her legs trembling. This had to be a nightmare. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, barely able to dial. She pressed the device to her ear, her breath ragged. 911, what is your emergency? A calm female voice asked. Faith struggled to speak. I need the police. My best friend and her husband, they're dead. Mom, please calm down. What's your location? Faith barely managed to give the address before dropping the phone. Her stomach lurched, and she turned away, dry heaving into the sink. The sight was burned into her mind. Peter, mutilated. Susan, stabbed. What happened here? She stumbled back into the sitting room, her heart racing. She had been at work all day. The last time she spoke to Susan was last night when she complained about Peter's behavior. But this was beyond anything she could imagine. She clutched her chest, trying to breathe. The sirens in the distance grew louder, but her mind was drowning in questions. Had Susan done this? Had Peter attacked her first? Why did it end like this? As the flashing blue and red lights flooded through the windows, Faith braced herself. This was just the beginning. The wailing sirens had barely died down before the street was filled with people. Neighbors gathered in clusters outside the house, murmuring, whispering, and pointing. Some stood in shock, others in morbid curiosity, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the horror within. The once peaceful neighborhood was now a crime scene, with yellow police tape stretching across the front yard like a barrier against the growing chaos. Faith sat on the front porch, her hands still trembling as an officer took her statement. She barely heard his questions. The gruesome image of Susan and Peter's bodies was burned into her mind. I just came to check on them, she repeated, her voice hoarse. The door was open. The living room was a mess, and then I found them in the kitchen. The officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, nodded while jotting down notes. Did they have any history of violence? Faith swallowed hard. They argued, sure, but nothing like this. The murmurs around them grew louder. I said it, that their marriage was not normal. A stout woman in a wrapper clapped her hands together dramatically. I always knew something was wrong. Peter was too quiet, and Susan was too sharp-mouthed. A bad combination. I heard she used to threaten him, another woman added. Maybe he snapped and killed her first. No, a younger man cut in, shaking his head. I heard it was Susan who killed him. They said his manhood was cut off, definitely the work of a woman scorned. The speculation spread like wildfire. Then came the media. Before long, reporters arrived, their cameras flashing, their microphones shoved into the faces of anyone willing to speak. A young journalist, dressed in a sleek black dress, stood before a cameraman. We are live at the scene of a gruesome domestic tragedy that has left a couple dead in what appears to be a case of mutual destruction. While the police have yet to release a statement, neighbors claim the couple had a rocky marriage with allegations of infidelity and violence. Faith turned away, sickened. They didn't know anything. They were turning Susan and Peter's deaths into a spectacle. Then she saw them, Susan's mother and Peter's younger brother James, pushing through the crowd. Susan! My daughter! No, no, her mother collapsed onto the ground, wailing. What happened? What happened to my baby? James, on the other hand, was furious. He stormed toward the police officers. Who did this? Who killed my brother? I need answers. Sir, please calm down. An officer tried to intervene. Calm down? My brother is dead. Someone killed him. Was it Susan? Huh? Did she do it? Faith stepped forward. James, we don't know what happened yet. His bloodshot eyes locked onto hers. You were the first person to find them, right? Tell me, was it Susan? Faith opened her mouth but hesitated. What could she say? Susan's mother sobbed louder, rocking back and forth. They were happy. My daughter loved him. She would never... James scoffed. Happy? That woman ruined my brother's life. She was controlling, manipulative. He always told me she threatened him. Faith felt the weight of both their grief crushing down on her. The questions, the accusations, the cameras, the whispers. The truth was she didn't know who was to blame, and that terrified her the most. Faith sat stiffly in the cold interrogation room of the police station, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was dimly lit, sterile, and silent, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. A metal table stood between her and Detective Cole, a man with sharp eyes and a hard jawline. He leaned forward, his fingers laced together, studying her intently. You were the first person to find the bodies, he said, his voice calm but firm. We need you to tell us everything you know about Peter and Susan. Their marriage, their fights, anything that could help us understand what happened. Faith swallowed. Her throat was dry and her mind was still reeling from the sight of their mutilated bodies. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to focus. They were in love once, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Cole nodded, motioning for her to continue. Faith's gaze drifted to the past, to the beginning of Peter and Susan's story, a time when everything was beautiful. They met in university, Faith started, her voice growing steadier. Susan was this smart, bold, and beautiful woman. She had dreams bigger than life itself. Peter was quiet but charming. He had this way of making her laugh even when she didn't want to. I remember the first time she told me about him. She was giggling like a schoolgirl. Detective Cole scribbled something in his notebook. So they were happy? Faith nodded. At first, yes. Susan came from a wealthy family, while Peter was from a modest background. But that never mattered to her. She loved him. When they graduated, she supported him while he built his career in finance. She always believed in him. Detective Cole raised an eyebrow. And what about Peter? Did he feel the same way? Faith hesitated. Yes, at least in the beginning. He adored her. He proposed in the most romantic way, at a rooftop dinner with fireworks in the background. Susan was over the moon. She called me that night, crying tears of joy. She couldn't wait to be his wife. Their wedding was like something out of a fairy tale, Faith continued. It was grand, elegant, one of those weddings people talk about for years. Every society page covered it. The venue was breathtaking, decorated with thousands of white roses. Susan looked stunning in her designer gown, and Peter couldn't take his eyes off her the entire night. She smiled faintly, lost in the memory. They danced like no one else was in the room. It was magical. Detective Cole tapped his pen against his notebook. A perfect love story, he mused. But something changed, didn't it? Faith sighed, rubbing her temples. Yes, something changed. Something dark crept into their marriage, and it turned their love into poison. The detective leaned forward. Tell me, Faith, what happened after the wedding? What led them to this? Faith exhaled shakily. She had to relive everything, the fights, the betrayals, the secrets. And as she prepared to speak, she realized she might be the only one who truly knew what had led to that bloody night. Faith shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edges of the cold metal chair. Detective Cole watched her carefully, waiting for her to continue. She took a slow breath, her mind drifting back to the turning point in Susan and Peter's marriage, the moment things started going wrong. It all began when Susan made the biggest mistake of her life, Faith murmured. Detective Cole frowned. What mistake? Faith looked up, her eyes filled with regret. She gave Peter half of her business. Susan was a born entrepreneur, Faith explained. Her family had money, but she built her own empire from the ground up. A high-end fashion line, luxurious boutiques, clients from all over the country. She was driven, passionate, and smart. But Peter, he was struggling at the time. His job in finance wasn't going as well as he had hoped, and he felt like a failure compared to Susan. He never said it out loud, but I could see it in his eyes. He was drowning in her shadow. Detective Cole jotted something down. And she gave him half of her company? Faith nodded. She wanted him to feel like a man. She wanted them to grow together. She thought, why not let him manage the business side? He has a financial background after all. So she transferred 50% of the company to his name and let him handle the expansion plans. Detective Cole raised an eyebrow. That's a huge leap of faith. Faith let out a humorless laugh. Yes, and at first it seemed like the best decision she ever made. For a while, Peter was the happiest man on earth. The business opened doors of luxury for him. High-end parties, elite business deals, expensive cars. He was grateful to Susan. I remember him telling me, Faith, I owe her everything. She made me a king. But, Detective Cole prompted. Faith sighed, her shoulders slumping. But something changed. The money, the power, it got to his head. At first, it was subtle. He started dressing differently, speaking with more authority. Susan loved it. She thought he was finally stepping into his full potential. But then the late nights began. He started coming home at odd hours, always claiming it was business meetings or client networking. At first, Susan didn't mind. She trusted him. But soon, the excuses became routine. And then, the women came. Detective Cole's pen stopped moving. Women? Faith's jaw tightened. Yes, Peter started womanizing. The richer he got, the more reckless he became. Susan found perfume on his shirts, lipstick stains. She saw text messages from different women, young models, socialites, even some of her own business associates. Detective Cole whistled low. And she confronted him? Faith nodded. Oh, she did. Susan was never the kind of woman to keep quiet. She demanded answers. But Peter, he changed. The grateful, humble husband she married was gone. He became arrogant, dismissive. He started gaslighting her, telling her she was imagining things or being too possessive. Detective Cole folded his arms. So the power dynamic shifted. Completely, Faith confirmed. Susan, the same woman who once had full control of her life, was now begging for her husband's attention. And Peter, he was living like a king. Faith paused, her heart heavy. That was the beginning of the end. Detective Cole tapped his pen against the table. So we have a loyal wife who gave her husband everything, and a husband who let wealth corrupt him. Faith clenched her fists. Yes, and I think that's what led to their downfall. Detective Cole leaned forward. Tell me, Faith, when did things turn violent? Faith swallowed hard. She knew the worst part of the story was yet to come. Faith stared at the detective, her fingers trembling as she clenched them together in her lap. She had dreaded telling this part of the story. It was the moment everything shattered, the moment Susan was no longer the woman she used to be. Detective Cole leaned in slightly. You're saying she found something that pushed her over the edge? Something so devastating that she couldn't hold back her rage? Faith nodded slowly, her voice hollow. Yes, she saw a text that destroyed her entire world. It was a Sunday afternoon, Faith began. Susan had been in her boutique all day, dealing with inventory and finalizing some contracts. She was exhausted. She wanted to go home, take a long bath, and maybe, just maybe, try to have a civil conversation with Peter about their marriage. But then she saw it. His phone was on the table, and a message popped up from an unsaved number. She wouldn't have checked it. Susan wasn't the type to snoop, but the words on the screen caught her eye. Baby, I just came back from the clinic. I tested positive. You need to get checked too. Susan's blood ran cold. She snatched the phone, unlocked it, and scrolled up. The conversation was sickening. Flirty messages, explicit photos, late-night rendezvous. And then, more messages confirming the worst. I can't believe it. I have HIV, and you probably do too. Susan froze. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she would pass out. Her hands were shaking as she kept reading. Another message from Peter himself, sent just days before, read, Don't worry, baby. My wife doesn't suspect a thing. She's too busy with work. And even if she finds out, what can she do? It was like a bomb exploded in her chest. Detective Cole let out a low breath. So not only was he cheating, but he had put her life at risk? Faith nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. Yes, and the worst part? He already knew. Peter knew he was HIV positive and still kept sleeping with his mistresses. He never told Susan. He let her believe they were just going through a rough patch. Detective Cole clenched his jaw. Jesus Christ. Faith exhaled shakily. Susan ran out of the house that moment. She didn't even confront him. She drove straight to the hospital, did every test they recommended, and waited. Detective Cole's pen hovered over his notebook. And the results? Faith closed her eyes, pained. Positive. She was HIV positive. She came straight to my house that night, Faith whispered. I had never seen her like that before. She wasn't just crying, she was broken. She collapsed onto my couch, sobbing so hard I thought she would stop breathing. Faith, she kept saying. He killed me. Peter has killed me. I tried to calm her down. I held her. I told her we would find a way to deal with it, that she needed to think before doing anything rash. But she wasn't listening. Detective Cole tilted his head. What exactly did she say? Faith sighed. She said, he took everything from me, my love, my trust, my health. And he's still out there, living like nothing happened? No, he won't get away with this. I begged her. I told her, Susan, please do not approach him in this rage. You need to think. Let's find another way. But she shook her head. She wiped her tears, stood up and said, I need to see him. I grabbed her hand. Promise me you won't do anything stupid. She looked me in the eyes. And she lied. She said, I just want to talk. Faith paused, her breath shaky. That was the last time I saw her alive. Faith rubbed her arms as if suddenly cold. She left my house that night in a storm of rage, and we both know what happened next. Detective Cole leaned back, exhaling sharply. So this wasn't just another domestic dispute. This was betrayal, revenge, and pure devastation. Faith nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Yes, and now they're both dead. The Daily Chronicle, February 20th, 2025, by Daniel Adebayo. Till Death Do Us Part. The betrayal that led to bloodshed. What should have been a love story for the ages ended in a gruesome tragedy that has left the city in shock. Peter and Susan Daniels, once the golden couple of high society, were found dead in their home in what police are calling a crime of passion fueled by betrayal. Neighbors described them as the perfect power couple. Susan, a celebrated business mogul, and Peter, a man who rose from obscurity to success through her generosity. Their grand wedding 5 years ago was the talk of the town, a fairy tale that many admired. But behind closed doors, their love was rotting from within. Sources close to the couple revealed that Susan had recently discovered that Peter had been unfaithful to her with multiple women. But the betrayal ran deeper. Peter had contracted HIV and never informed his wife, exposing her to the disease. When Susan tested positive, the weight of the deceit was too much to bear. On the fateful night of February 18th, Susan, consumed by rage, confronted Peter in their home. What began as a confrontation ended in violence, leaving Peter mutilated and Susan bleeding out beside him. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Detectives have described the incident as a chilling reminder that love, when tainted by deceit, can turn deadly. Family, friends, and the entire city now mourn the loss of 2 lives destroyed by trust broken beyond repair. As investigations continue, one question lingers in the minds of all. Could this tragedy have been prevented? A love story that should have lasted forever instead became a cautionary tale.